It's part of our social history and it's important to talk about. Valium or Ativan, better known as Benzodiazepines. They were part of our history, but it's how it affected people. That's what I want to talk about. Oh, for the better to begin with. They gave people a beginning to get back into the social world, give them the ability to function, to work, to socialise and to manage. So I'm going to tell you some truths about this real story, about this miracle drug that people were taking in the 1960s and 70s, and how the lack of knowledge and the lack of proper social care and the promotion of the drug by pharmaceutical companies made such a difference to how we lived and the excitement, and then following the hopelessness and the misery. And it was a drug that was formally named by the pharmaceutical companies again as Mother's Little Helper. So let's get on with it. Now, just before I start, I'm not a doctor. This is only for insight, entertainment, and some research facts. If you want medical advice about any anxiety feelings, please consult your medical professional, not me. Okay. So, we're going to go back and talk about it from the beginning. So, not enough hours in the day, more manual household jobs, scrubbing floors, hand washing, boiling clothes, using those heavy manual early household machines. Imagine what life was like, looking after kids, small kids, ill kids, cooking from scratch, juggling bills, and having very little social life or escape. Poorly babies needing more attention and dinner, who had to be on the table at a certain time, and making that little bit of money stretch through the whole week. I know many families have this pressure, and many do cope well with these stressful situations, but for those who didn't, at a time when there was less help from the National Assistance Board or social care, well, there was an answer. And it was a miracle drug. Because talking therapies were non-existent. And the advice that was given to mothers, maybe fathers, by their elders or even by their spouses was just get on with it. So what did they do to relax, to lower those stress levels when it all seemed to be getting too much? The doctor had the solution, a tranquilizer that would make everything look much better. Was the answer Valium? Of course, it's important to say that anxiety can be very, very debilitating, and we all go through it in part of our lives. But I am rather hoping that 50 years on there are better ways and better strategies to get assistance and help for people that are going through this terrible time. And all I can do is wish you all the very, very best if you are going through such stress and tension. Now, Valium is a member of the Benzodiazepines family, which are a collective medication for calming the nerves, as then phrased. People will go to the doctors and just turn around and say, I'm suffering with my nerves, or I've got bad nerves, for the doctor to understand that they were suffering from chronic or acute anxiety, or even insomnia. Now, Valium, known as Diazepam, or Ativan, better known as Diazepam, was one of these members of these Benzodiazepines families. That's just to name a few. Which was advertised and promoted as a miracle drug. The best since antibiotics. The very best thing since sliced bread. Now, benzodiazepines acts on the part of the brain that targets and increases GABA, which is gamma anemobutyric. I've pronounced that wrong. Gamma anemobutyric acid, which is a primary neurotransmitter that reduces nervous activity in the brain, thus causing calm and getting people what they thought was a good night's sleep, reducing rapid thoughts. It basically slows down certain neurons from firing. This type of medication came around as early as the 1950s, and it was brought on by a fellow called Leo Sternbach when he discovered the properties chlorodiazepoxide hydrochloride, known as Librium. And soon after that, other benzodiazepines were born, such as the Diazepam, the Valium, which was produced during the 1960s. And it was used in abundance in the 1970s and the 1980s. Before I go any further, I do apologise about my pronunciations, so be nice to me. You lovely people. Now, this fella, Leo Sternbach, who first synthesized these drugs, didn't make a lot of money out of it for himself. All he wanted to do was make people feel better. He was born in Hungary in 1908, and he had a passion for chemistry and developing pharmaceuticals, which kept him busy because he was working right up until he was 95 years old. In his younger days, he had a practice and he had 241 patients, which was probably a lot back then, but certainly not compared to today. But he had time on his hands, and he joined a giant company called Hoffman La Roche in the USA, in New Jersey. Now, he was also credited for more drugs, such as nitrazepam, known as Mogadon, and I think it's pronounced flunitrazepam, commonly known as Rohypnol. Rohypnol. Now, Rohypnol is prescribed in very few places now for severe insomnia, but it was everywhere at one time, and it's been publicly known as a dangerous drug for many years. In many cases, serious assault and many sexual assault cases. It's illegal to possess the substance, and in fact, in the UK, to possess it, you can get up to 2 years in prison. And if you're dealing with it, that can give you up to a 14-year prison sentence. So you can see how dangerous it is. Due to its effect of something that's called anterograde amnesia. Now, anterograde amnesia is a forgetfulness that you won't forget anything before the action and you'll remember everything after the action. You just forget everything whilst you're under the influence. So that was why it was coined as the date rape. But not only that, it was also for people that wanted to rob people, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But what manufacturers did, they put in a blue dye. So if they popped it into anybody's drink, the blue dye would obviously give the game away. It's not legal on the NHS today in the UK, and it's been banned in many, many countries. Like many benzodiazepines, it has an addiction warning, along with terrible withdrawal symptoms for prolonged use. Now, I'll tell you about this robbery. Write this story about this robbery, and it involved Rohypnol. There was a fella that used to start coming in our local pub. He befriended a friend of mine. Now, this friend of mine, he was quite well off. He was very generous. But the younger guy, he was down and out. To hear him talk, he had an hard life, and he was looking for somewhere permanently to stay. And over a short amount of time, this guy says, well, you can rent my spare room. And one evening, I think he got some friends round, and this young guy who had moved in with him decided it was his turn to make the tea. And within about half an hour, this young fella was just zonked out fast asleep. I mean, they'd had a few drinks, so the guy must have thought, well, he's just leave him on the settee and let him sleep it off. So I went to bed, and it got to about, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and the guy came downstairs, the owner, and says, they heard all this rattling, and it was this young guy. He'd started robbing the place, but he wasn't robbing it in a hurry. He was just stuffing things in his bag so nonchalantly, as though he got all the time in the world, making a racket, making a clatter or whatever. So the guy said, what the hell do you think you're doing? The older guy, and he says, you're supposed to be fast asleep. He went, no, you just woke me up making all that noise. He went, but you were asleep instantly for about 4 or 5 hours. So it turned out the guy obviously phoned the police, and it turned out that the guy had given Rohypnol to the owner of the house, but he'd give it to the wrong person. The silly bugger went and drank it himself. It's a funny story, but imagine if it had been the other way around. That guy would have been fast asleep and they'd have had nothing left. His entire building. So that's how dangerous Rohypnol can be. So we're back in the 1970s, and we're imagining women mainly getting stressed with bills and family life and having little to do outside of the house, nothing socially, no escape. In the kitchen sink drama days, time where people were getting TVs and watching the bad news of maybe the Cold War or the strikes or the power cuts. And it was easy to go to the doctors to talk about what their problems were. It was even easier for doctors to start prescribing these wonder drugs. It instantly relieved all those awful, debilitating symptoms within minutes of taking these pills. It was a safer way of derailing anxiety ever since, the previous Barbiturates medications, which were more dangerous, were phased out. Safer Valium had arrived, and panic attacks, they were a thing of the past. In this era, obviously men must have suffered those similar symptoms, but they were less likely to talk about it, mainly because of the stiff upper lip or being less masculine if they talked about their feelings. So I should imagine many men continued suffering in silence. But suddenly people were taking this medication, able to function, able to wake up, able to go to sleep without having to count sheep and all that. But no one was investigating the root cause of this onset of anxiety because there wasn't any need. They inhibited neurons from firing, slowing the brain down. All those racing thoughts were going. So that was the explanation. That was the answer, I should say. And pharmaceutical companies were pushing this medication onto doctors as the effective treatment for other problems. Sleeping aids, anticonvulsions, withdrawal from alcoholics. They were all being advertised in the medical journal as a wonder drug. Valium is slower acting and has a long half-life, so it could stay in the system for longer. So therefore they may only have to take it twice a day or even once a day. And the efficacy was a lot better than barbiturates. And efficacy just tells you just how effective the drug is and how long it lasts, And there are other drugs that are sort of quicker in acting, such as lorazepam. Lorazepam sort of starts to work within 20 minutes and has a shorter half-life. And they're normally given to patients that are maybe just about to have an operation. They're absolutely terrified and that kind of thing. It calms a lot quicker than the other benzodiazepines. And of course, they were great for sleeping tablets, and people weren't worrying about having sleepless nights. Now, by the mid-1970s, diazepam was the most prescribed medication in the world, not just in the UK. But what could ever go wrong? Agoraphobic people were starting to venture outdoors, bit by bit, and doctors were adjusting the doses to more or less what the patients were asking. 2 milligrams, 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams. Some patients were having up to 30 milligrams a day, and the pharmaceutical companies were making a fortune. Originally produced in 1963 by Hoffman La Roche, the patent did expire in 1985. So Valium then could be sold without permission from the creator under the title of public domain. So other companies could make it. Not anyone, by the way. So put your cooking pot away. Albeit much safer than barbiturates, which were the predecessor for anxiety and depression. The major interaction between alcohol and these medications is pretty severe. They both sedate the nervous system and they can suppress breathing. And if they're overdosed with enough alcohol, you can look at literally the brain forgetting to breathe. So obviously never ever mix any of these medications with alcohol. It's all on the black label or whatever it's called. But it was still safer than barbiturates because barbiturates were more common for overdose. A slight extra dose could cause problems, or a little bit of alcohol could cause problems. And barbiturates is a derivative of something called barbituric acid, which was introduced in 1903 as a hypnotic or a sedative. Even general anaesthetic, but they were phased out the mainstream in the 1960s due to their easy danger of overdose and terrible withdrawal symptoms. They were replaced by the safer alternative of benzodiazepines. Many famous stars had deaths connected to these barbiturates, such as chlorohydrate, Nembutal, Sagorbital, such as Marilyn Monroe. Not that that was ever proved that that's why she died. But overdoses, as I said, were less common with barbiturates, but they still should be taken with care because they do sedate the CNS, act on GABA receptors, and the advice from any healthcare profession would be manage your dose according to your doctor and other medications which your doctor should be looking at for any what they call contradictions. But that's all medical advice that you should seek from anywhere but me. Right, people were then later on in years becoming aware of the side effects. as the doses increased, as they required more. Blood pressure and dizziness and forgetfulness and many more, which will appear on the medication instructions from doctors. Side effects could include agitation, confusion and memory issues. So here we are, we're moving to the late 1970s and millions of these Valium pills are being prescribed by doctors. And many British women and some in the nation, they weren't a bit worried. But it's getting more known as doses are increasing to maintain that calmness, to maintain that sleep that patients were asking for. Was there a situation getting worse? Were their nerves? Were they fraying more as the months and the years went by? Or was benzodiazepines not doing the job as they used to do? There was never any intervention or any checks. It was just have another prescription. One example how the drug was pushed onto people through advertising from the pharmaceutical companies was how it pushed away anxiety and worry, and how women were able to be themselves. Another aggressive campaign. One of them was showing a 15-year lifespan of a single girl called Jan, who couldn't cope with any relationships, and she'd been on her own for years. And then this wonderful medication solved a problem. She met somebody and they all lived happily ever after. Shocking sexism. How about that, eh? But they weren't looked upon as anything more than women were more likely to take to have anxiety and depression than men. Valium was referred to as the little mother's helper. Was also included in a Rolling Stones record with that in its, I think it was in its title or certainly in the track. Right? This was indicative of how widespread this medication was. Mainly for women or aimed at women as the main beneficiaries. And for 14 years in the USA alone, it was the most prescribed medicine. Millions of prescriptions were just written out. But now we're going to go into the 80s, when people were becoming more aware of the addictive side of this type of medication. And now the meds had to be increased to get the same efficacy of calm. And in some cases, began to lower their effect. In simple terms, benzodiazepines work on the brain system, acting on the receptors to calm it, such as anxiety and rapid thoughts, as I mentioned. But GABA receptors began to get lazy, they began to close down. So the drug was replacing the natural calming system of the brain. So it was a bit like handing one job over to another. And more medication was required to get the same effect. Withdrawal symptoms were beginning to be noticed as more and more people wanted to get off them when they started hearing these horror stories. The taper method, which has to be strictly adhered to, both for psychological and physical effects, had to be adhered to. Stopping abruptly is dangerous. People found it impossible to get off this type of medication. Side effects were quite troublesome. The forgetfulness and the lethargy of some people. They started to say they were acting and they were walking around like zombies. Not to mention that ever feeling of aggression. In fact, the story even got on a popular BBC TV series, That's Life, in the 1980s with Esther Ranson and the gang, concentrating on Valium and Diazepam, how doctors were over-prescribing them and getting the blame for the problem. The glory of the story of housewives popping pills to make their challenging days a breeze, as advertised by the pharmaceutical companies, had come to an end. That's not to say that benzodiazepines don't have a place in the world today, because they certainly do, when they're carefully prescribed and carefully administered. They've got many, many positive uses. Temporary anxiety, for an example, like I told you, alcohol withdrawal, treatment for certain narcotic intakes such as amphetamines, uppers and speeds, treatment for serotonin syndrome, which is a rare and severe case of an adverse reaction to SSRIs, which we now call antidepressants. And diazepam can also relieve some types of pain temporarily, particularly through swelling. So what happened next? Well, they got on the black market as recreational drugs. Many people were injecting sort of jellified versions of the drug and obviously causing death. There was a case where 17,000 women in the UK formed a lawsuit against the pharmaceutical companies who had failed to state the addictive side of this medication. Unfortunately, after a long fight, when legal aid was dropped, the cases were withdrawn. It did, however, highlight the amount of people who spoke out about what they were prescribed, and they described it as terrible withdrawal symptoms of using medication long term. It was no longer looked to the pharmaceutical companies as the wonder drug. Withdrawal, like more anxiety and seizures, were common. It was news that had unfolded in more and more documentaries. The attitude began to change and doctors moved towards prescribing antidepressants such as paroxetine and Prozac. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are now the choice for anxiety and depression today, which have more or less replaced benzodiazepines with less common side effects and less terrible withdrawal symptoms, although you can't just stop taking them right away. But they're not perfect either. Well, back to benzodiazepines, just to finalise, I just want to tell you a little story of the damage that these tablets have caused. Personally, my mother told me when I was about 2 years old, or maybe younger, I don't remember this, but I was a crybaby. Now, she got 4 kids and I was the youngest. And a woman simply came up to one day and she says, "Mrs. How the hell do you cope with 4 kids and running a household?" Up until that point, my mother was absolutely fine, but someone got into her head, and she just became a quivering wreck. Now, I can only imagine if she'd have gone somewhere to have spoken about this and said, "You know what, I've just got it into my head, I'm not coping. Maybe today the treatment would have been very different than it was in 1969. The doctor put her straight on Valium. And she started to take the Valium, and she was absolutely fine. She tried to get off the Valium, and during the time she got off the Valium, after I don't know how long, her nerves, as she called it, got worse. So she was straight back on the Valium. But this time she wasn't on just so many milligrams, she was at an increased dosage. They called them nervous breakdowns in those days, but they're more, I would say, acute anxiety feelings, or they're the times where you'd really need to reach out to get help. But every time she went back to the doctors, he would just say, "It's just your nerves, miss." And then he ended up giving her Librium. Librium in the morning, Diazepam throughout the day, and sleeping tablets during the night. All benzodiazepines. It got to the stage where she wouldn't go out the door. For years, wouldn't go out the door. And then she would only go out the door if she had somebody with her. No taxis, no holidays, no bus rides for years and years and years. And then it was suggested that she went to see a psychiatrist. Now, my mother was born in 1942. And the idea of seeing a psychiatrist back in them days meant that she thought she'd be chucked in the loony bin, as they called them back then. That was the mentality of it all. Too frightened to go to the doctors to talk about it in case it took her off the medication. Too frightened to talk to a specialist in case she got locked up, as people did in her youth, because her Auntie Joan apparently did. All that could be done was to stay on the medication. And that, when you rewind, was just because one woman said to her one day, "How do you cope with 4 kids?" And it just destabilised her. That's all it did. What would have been easier to put her on the right track than put her on all this medication? And I can even remember, we moved house quite a few times. But you can guarantee she was terrified of having a new doctor, just in case it took her off these medications. And I can remember one doctor, he did try to say, "I'll put you on SSRIs," which we didn't know at the time, it just was going to change your medication. But the idea of coming off that medication and going on to a medication, well, that was never going to work. As a kid, I never realised or understood this at the time. I never understood her depression. I never understood her anxieties. Not really. I do now, because we all go through it from time to time in our lives. What about that? Anyway, thank you so much for watching. And it was a different one, wasn't it? But I thought it was important to talk about it. Thanks for watching. You too watching at home. And bye for now.